In the heart of New Orleans, there lived a 17-year-old boy who had dreams bigger than the challenges life threw at him. Let's call him the Kid. This young man grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and every day was a battle against stereotypes and struggles. His mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, but she always reminded her son, "Your mind is your strongest weapon." She believed education could open doors that seemed permanently shut for people like them. The Kid took those words to heart. While other teenagers his age spent their afternoons playing basketball or hanging out, he buried himself in books, law books to be exact. He borrowed them from the local library, reading about court cases, laws, and how justice worked. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a passion. He wanted to understand the system because he knew one day, somehow, he'd need to fight it. Little did he know, that day would come sooner than expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky orange, the Kid walked home from a tutoring session. He had been helping some younger kids with math, a way to give back to his community. The streets were quiet except for the occasional car driving by. But then chaos erupted. A group of teenagers nearby started vandalizing a store, smashing windows and spray painting graffiti on the walls. Panic spread quickly, and before anyone realized what was happening, police sirens wailed in the distance. When officers arrived, they didn't bother asking questions. They saw a group of black teens near the scene and assumed guilt by association. Despite the Kid's protests, "I wasn't part of this. I was just walking home." He was handcuffed along with everyone else. No explanations mattered. To the cops, he looked like just another face in the crowd, another statistic waiting to fill a cell. The next morning, the Kid found himself sitting in a cold, sterile courtroom. The air smelled faintly of old wood and cleaning chemicals, and the benches creaked under the weight of nervous defendants and their families. When his name was called, he stood up, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. It was too big around, the shoulders and baggy at the waist, but it was all he had. He wanted to show respect even if no one else did. The judge presiding over the case was known throughout the city for his tough demeanor. People whispered about him behind closed doors, saying he didn't believe in second chances, especially not for young black men. As the Kid approached the stand, the judge barely glanced at him. Instead, he smirked, almost amused by the sight of this teenager trying so hard to look presentable. "Another troublemaker," the judge muttered under his breath, loud enough for the court reporter to hear. Without giving the Kid a chance to speak, the judge rattled off a list of charges: vandalism, destruction of property, resisting arrest. None of it was true, but the Kid didn't get a word in edgewise. Then came the kicker, the bail amount. It was impossibly high, far more than his family could ever afford. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself, and let out a short, condescending laugh. That laugh echoed in the Kid's ears. It wasn't just mockery, it felt like dismissal, like he wasn't even worth considering innocent until proven guilty. For a moment, the Kid felt defeated. How could he possibly fight this? He was just a teenager, up against a system designed to crush people like him. But then something inside him stirred. All those hours spent studying law books, all those late nights poring over case studies, it wasn't for nothing. He clenched his fists under the table, took a deep breath, and decided right then and there that he wouldn't go down without a fight. As the judge prepared to move on to the next case, the Kid did something unexpected. He rose to his feet again, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Your Honor," he began. "May I say something?" The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. After a pause, he nodded, probably expecting some rehearsed plea for mercy. What he got instead was something entirely different. The Kid started talking, not pleading, not begging, but speaking with confidence. He cited specific laws, pointed out flaws in the arrest process, and argued that the evidence against him was weak at best. At first, the judge chuckled, thinking it was some memorized speech from a TV show. But as the Kid continued, breaking down complex legal concepts into simple terms, the laughter faded. The room grew quieter, and soon, all eyes were on him. Even The prosecutor looked shocked. Here was a teenager standing alone without a lawyer, dismantling their case piece by piece. The kid wasn't just reciting facts, he was making connections, showing how the system had failed him. For the first time in years, the judge felt uncertain. Who was this boy, and how did he know so much? During a brief recess, the court clerk leaned over to whisper something to the judge. Did you know he's been teaching himself law since he was 12? There are rumors he wants to go to Harvard someday. The judge frowned, processing this information. Maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated the kid, and maybe this wasn't going to be as straightforward as he thought. By the time the session resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The kid wasn't just another defendant anymore. He was someone to watch, someone who refused to let prejudice define his fate. When the session resumed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge sat upright, his usual smug expression replaced by a look of cautious curiosity. He glanced at the kid standing before him, still wearing that oversized suit, but now with an air of quiet determination. For the first time, the judge seemed unsure of what to do next. This wasn't how things usually went in his courtroom. Defendants were supposed to be nervous, intimidated, and ultimately silent. But this teenager, he was different. The kid didn't waste any time. As soon as the judge gave him permission to continue, he dove back into his argument. His voice was steady, almost calm, but there was a fire behind his words. He began breaking down the prosecutor's case step by step, pointing out inconsistencies and gaps in logic. Your Honor, he said, looking directly at the judge, the police report states that I was seen running away from the scene. But no one actually saw me doing anything wrong. Running doesn't mean guilt, it means I was scared. Wouldn't anyone run if they saw chaos breaking out? The judge leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over his notepad. He wasn't used to defendants questioning evidence like this, especially not teenagers. Normally, people either accepted their fate or relied on public defenders to speak for them. But here was this kid, taking charge of his own defense with a level of knowledge that bordered on professional. It was unsettling and fascinating all at once. As the kid continued, he cited specific laws and past court rulings, explaining how they applied to his situation. He talked about the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and argued that the police had violated his rights by arresting him without probable cause. They didn't ask me questions, he said firmly. They didn't give me a chance to explain. They just assumed I was guilty because of where I was standing. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She hadn't expected this kind of pushback, and she certainly hadn't prepared for someone who could match her legally. When it was her turn to respond, she stumbled over her words, trying to defend the charges but struggling to counter the points the kid had made. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that her case was built on shaky ground. Meanwhile, the crowd in the courtroom grew restless. Word had spread quickly about what was happening, and murmurs rippled through the room. Some people whispered, in disbelief, while others nodded approvingly, clearly rooting for the kid. Even the bailiff, who rarely showed emotion, couldn't help but glance at the judge with raised eyebrows. Something unusual was unfolding here, and everyone could feel it. The judge, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. He tried to regain control of the situation by interrupting the kid mid-sentence. Hold on, he said sharply. Where did you learn all this? You're not a lawyer. There was a hint of irritation in his tone, but also a flicker of genuine curiosity. The kid paused, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. I taught myself, Your Honor, he replied simply. I read books, studied cases, and learned everything I could about the law. I did it because I wanted to understand how the system works, and how it sometimes fails people like me. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. People in the courtroom exchanged glances, some nodding, silently in agreement. The judge frowned, tapping his pen against the desk. He didn't know what to make of this kid. On one hand, he admired the determination and intelligence on display. On the other hand, he felt a twinge of discomfort, as if he were being forced to confront truths he'd rather ignore. To buy himself some time, the judge called for another recess. As the courtroom emptied, he motioned for the court clerk to approach. "Tell me more about this boy," he demanded. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Like I said earlier, he's been teaching himself law since he was a kid. Spends hours at the library, reads every book he can get his hands on. Folks around here call him a prodigy." The judge rubbed his temples, deep in thought. He had spent years building a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense jurist. Now, he found himself facing a moral dilemma. If he dismissed the charges, it would look like he was backing down, a blow to his pride. But if he pressed forward, he risked exposing the flaws in the system he represented. Either way, the outcome wouldn't be easy. When the session resumed, the judge announced a decision that surprised everyone. "Listen carefully," he said, addressing the kid. "If you can successfully defend yourself during the preliminary hearing, I'll drop all charges. But if you fail..." He let the sentence trail off, leaving the consequences unspoken. It was clear. This was a test, one designed to challenge the kid's abilities and prove whether he was as smart as he seemed. The kid didn't hesitate. "I accept, Your Honor," he said confidently. His voice carried a sense of purpose, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. The courtroom erupted in whispers again, but the judge silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel. "We'll reconvene in 3 days for the hearing," he declared before adjourning the session. Outside the courthouse, the kid was swarmed by reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in his face, and strangers patted him on the back, offering words of encouragement. One elderly woman grabbed his hand and said, "You're fighting for all of us, son. Don't let them win." Her words stayed with him long after the crowd dispersed. Over the next few days, the kid threw himself into preparation. He reviewed every detail of his case, studying the police reports, witness statements, and legal precedents. He reached out to volunteer lawyers for advice, spending hours poring over notes and rehearsing arguments. Late at night, when the city fell silent, he sat at his kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out before him, his mother watching from the doorway. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to remind him why he was doing this. By the time the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. People had come from all over the city to witness what promised to be a historic event. Reporters lined the walls, cameras rolling, while activists held up signs supporting justice reform. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. Everyone wanted to see if this teenager could pull off the impossible. As the kid walked in, carrying a worn briefcase filled with his notes, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He knew the stakes were high, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in fairness and equality. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about proving that even the most marginalized voices deserved to be heard. The prosecutor opened the hearing with a confident statement, laying out the charges and painting the kid as guilty by association. But when it was the kid's turn to cross-examine the witnesses, something remarkable happened. With each question, he chipped away at the prosecution's narrative, exposing holes in their story and forcing the witnesses to admit they hadn't actually seen him commit a crime. His calm demeanor and sharp intellect left the courtroom in awe. By the end of the hearing, it was clear who had won. The judge, visibly moved, delivered his verdict. All charges were dismissed. The room erupted in cheers, and the kid was surrounded by well-wishers, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a triumph for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or underestimated. As he stepped outside the courthouse, bathed in sunlight and applause, the kid allowed himself a small smile. He knew this was only the beginning. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 days later, and those 72 hours felt like an eternity for the kid. Every minute was packed with preparation. He barely slept, his mind racing with strategies, counter-arguments, and possible scenarios. The dining table in his small apartment became his command center, stacked high with legal textbooks, handwritten notes, and printouts of court rulings. His mother, though exhausted from her double shifts, stayed up late to keep him company. She didn't understand all the legal jargon, but she listened intently as he rehearsed his arguments out loud. "Does this sound convincing?" he'd ask her after explaining a point. She'd nod, her eyes filled with pride and worry. "You're doing everything you can," she'd reply softly. "That's all anyone can ask for." Word about the upcoming hearing spread like wildfire through the community. People couldn't stop talking about the teenager who dared to stand up to the system. Local activists organized rallies outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Believe in the power of truth." Even strangers stopped the kid on the street to offer words of encouragement. One elderly man pressed a crumpled $20 bill into his hand, saying, "For your fight, son. Use it however you need." The support buoyed the kid's spirits, but it also added pressure. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was carrying the hopes of countless others who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. This realization weighed heavily on him, but it also fueled his determination. If he could win this case, maybe, just maybe, he could inspire others to believe they too could challenge injustice. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters, activists, family members, and curious onlookers filled every seat. Some stood along the walls while others waited outside, hoping to catch snippets of what was happening inside. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed as the kid walked in, clutching his worn briefcase. He scanned the room briefly, taking in the sea of faces. For a fleeting moment, he felt overwhelmed. But then he remembered why he was there. Not just for himself, but for everyone counting on him. The prosecutor opened the proceedings with a confident tone, laying out the charges and painting the kid as guilty by association. She spoke smoothly, weaving a narrative that relied heavily on assumptions rather than concrete evidence. Her voice carried authority, and she clearly expected the judge and audience to accept her version of events without question. But when it was the kid's turn to cross-examine the witnesses, the tide began to turn. With each question, he dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. He started with the arresting officer, asking calmly, "Can you tell me exactly what I was doing when you approached me?" The officer hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "You were near the scene," he finally replied. "Near the scene isn't the same as being part of it," the kid countered gently, leaning forward slightly. "Did you see me break anything? Did you hear me encourage anyone else to vandalize? The store?" The officer mumbled something about circumstantial evidence, but the damage was done. The jury, and everyone in the courtroom, could see the holes in the testimony. Next, the kid turned his attention to the eyewitnesses. One by one, he asked them to describe what they had seen. Each account contradicted the last, revealing inconsistencies that made their stories unreliable. By the time he finished questioning them, it was clear none of them had actually witnessed him committing a crime. They had simply assumed guilt based on where he was standing. Throughout the hearing, the kid maintained a calm and respectful demeanor. He never raised his voice or showed frustration, even when the prosecutor tried to interrupt or discredit him. Instead, he responded with logic and clarity, citing specific laws and precedents to back up his points. At one point, he referenced a landmark Supreme Court ruling that directly contradicted the prosecution's argument. The prosecutor looked stunned, fumbling through her notes as she tried to recover. As the hearing progressed, the energy in the room shifted. What had started as skepticism turned into admiration. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on the kid's every word. Even the judge, who had initially dismissed him as just another troublemaker, seemed captivated. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, occasionally glancing up at the kid with a mix of surprise and respect. When it came time for closing arguments, the kid took a deep breath before addressing the court. His voice was steady, but there was a raw honesty in his words that resonated deeply with everyone present. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't just about me. It's about fairness. It's about giving people the benefit of the doubt, instead of jumping to conclusions based on stereotypes. It's about recognizing that we all deserve a chance to prove our innocence, not be punished because of where we come from or how we look." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I'm standing here today not because I want special treatment, but because I believe in justice. Real justice. Justice that sees people as individuals, not labels. Justice that holds the system accountable when it fails us. If I walk out of this courtroom today with my name cleared, it won't just be a victory for me. It'll be a reminder that change is possible. That no matter how stacked the odds are, we can still fight for what's right. By the time he finished speaking, the room was silent. Not a single person moved. The weight of his words hung in the air, echoing long after he sat down. Even the prosecutor looked shaken, realizing she was on the wrong side of history in this moment. The judge sat motionless for several minutes, his expression unreadable. Finally, he cleared his throat and addressed the court. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, he said slowly, "I find no grounds to proceed with these charges. Case dismissed." A wave of cheers erupted, filling the courtroom, with a joyous noise. Strangers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. The kid sat frozen in his chair, unable to process what had just happened. When it finally sank in, he buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. His mother rushed to his side, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You really did it." Outside the courthouse, the celebration continued. Reporters swarmed the kid, firing questions left and right. Activists chanted slogans, holding up banners that praised his courage. Complete strangers approached him, shaking his hand and thanking him for giving them hope. One woman handed him a bouquet of flowers, saying, "This is for never giving up." But amidst the chaos, the kid remained grounded. As he stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by supporters, he knew this was only the beginning. Winning this case was a step forward, but the larger battle for justice was far from over, and he was ready to keep fighting, for himself, for his community, and for anyone else who needed someone to believe in them. The dismissal of the charges was a monumental moment, but for the kid it wasn't just about the victory, it was about what came next. As he stood outside the courthouse that day, surrounded by cheering supporters and flashing cameras, he felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. People weren't just celebrating him, they were celebrating the idea that someone like him could rise above the odds. And now, they were looking to him as proof that change was possible. Word of his courtroom triumph spread quickly, not just locally but across the country. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath tale of resilience and justice. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Believe in Justice" and "Courage over Bias." Strangers shared memes of the kid standing confidently in his oversized suit, calling him the real MVP. But while the attention was flattering, it also brought challenges. For every person who praised him, there were others who dismissed his success as a fluke or accused him of seeking fame. Some even suggested he had manipulated the system, a claim that stung deeply because it undermined everything he had fought for. Despite the negativity, the kid remained focused. He knew this moment was bigger than him. It wasn't about proving doubters wrong. It was about using his newfound platform to make a difference. Offers poured in from universities, law firms, and advocacy groups eager to support his journey. Scholarships arrived in thick envelopes, each one promising opportunities he'd only dreamed of. But instead of letting the praise go to his head, he stayed humble. He remembered where he came from, the cramped apartment, the long nights studying. By dim light, the sacrifices his mother made to keep food on the table. Those memories grounded him, reminding him why he started down this path in the first place. One offer stood out among the rest, a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. When the acceptance letter arrived, the kid stared at it for a long time, almost unable to believe it was real. Growing up, Harvard had seemed like a distant dream, something reserved for people who didn't look like him or come from places like his neighborhood. Yet here it was, tangible proof that hard work and determination could open doors no matter how tightly shut they seemed. His mother cried when she saw the letter, clutching it to her chest as if holding on to hope itself. "You're going to do great things," she told him through tears. "This is just the beginning." Before heading off to college, the kid spent the summer giving back to his community. He organized free legal workshops for young people, teaching them about their rights and how to navigate the justice system. He partnered with local activists to push for reforms, speaking at rallies and town hall meetings about the need for fairness and accountability. At first, he worried he wouldn't be taken seriously. After all, he was still just a teenager. But as soon as he started talking, people listened. They saw the passion in his eyes and heard the conviction in his voice. He spoke not as someone seeking sympathy, but as someone determined to create change. During one workshop, a young girl raised her hand timidly. She couldn't have been older than 12. "What if nobody listens to us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. The kid knelt down so he was eye level with her, his expression softening. "Sometimes people won't listen," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean you stop trying. You speak louder, smarter, and with more heart, and eventually, someone will hear you. I promise." His words resonated not just with the girl but with everyone in the room. They clapped softly, nodding in agreement. For many of them, this was the first time they'd felt empowered to challenge the injustices they faced daily. Seeing the impact he was having reinforced the kid's belief that education and action went hand in hand. He couldn't fix the entire system overnight, but he could plant seeds of change and trust that others would water them. When fall arrived, the kid packed his bags and headed to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Stepping onto Harvard's campus for the first time was surreal. The towering libraries, ivy-covered buildings, and bustling student life felt worlds away from the streets of New Orleans. At first, he struggled to adjust. The workload was intense, and the pressure to succeed weighed heavily on him. Imposter syndrome crept in, whispering doubts into his ear. Do I really belong here? Am I good enough? But whenever those thoughts threatened to overwhelm him, he reminded himself why he was there, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He threw himself into his studies, excelling in classes that challenged even the brightest minds. Professors marveled at his ability to connect complex legal theories to real-world issues, often inviting him to contribute to research projects or co-author papers. Classmates sought his advice during study sessions, impressed by his depth of knowledge and willingness to help. Slowly but surely, he began to carve out a space for himself, not just as a student but as a leader. Outside the classroom, the kid continued advocating for justice reform. He joined student organizations focused on civil rights, organized panel discussions featuring prominent lawyers and activists, and volunteered at legal clinics serving underprivileged communities. Each experience deepened his understanding of the law and strengthened his resolve to use it as a tool for good. By the time graduation rolled around, he had earned not only top honors, but also the respect of peers and professors alike. The day he received his law degree was bittersweet. On one hand, he was proud of how far he'd come. From a teenager fighting for his freedom in a biased courtroom, to a Harvard-educated attorney ready to take on the world. On the other hand, he knew the hardest battles lay ahead. The legal system was still riddled with inequalities, and dismantling them would require patience, persistence, and courage. But he was ready. Armed with his education and fueled by his experiences, he returned to New Orleans, not as a defendant, but as a defender of justice. His first major case after passing the bar exam was eerily similar to his own. A young man, barely 18, had been arrested during a protest and charged with crimes he claimed he didn't commit. The parallels weren't lost on the kid. As he stood in the same courthouse where his own life had changed forever, he felt a surge of determination. This time, he wasn't alone. He had resources, expertise, and a team of supporters behind him. More importantly, he had a mission to ensure no one else had to face the system without a fair chance. The trial was grueling, filled with moments of frustration and doubt. The prosecution pushed back hard, determined to secure a conviction. But the kid refused to back down. Drawing on everything he'd learned over the years, he crafted a defense strategy that left no stone unturned. He cross-examined witnesses relentlessly, exposing inconsistencies in their testimonies. He cited precedents and statutes with precision, leaving the opposing counsel scrambling to respond. And when it came time for closing arguments, he delivered a speech that echoed his earlier plea for justice, but this time with the authority of a seasoned lawyer. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "this isn't just about my client. It's about the message we send to our youth, to our communities, and to ourselves. Are we a society that punishes based on assumptions, or are we a society that seeks truth and fairness? My client deserves better than baseless accusations and knee-jerk reactions. He deserves justice, and so does everyone else who walks through these doors." When the verdict came in, not guilty, the courtroom erupted in applause. The young man hugged his family, tears streaming down his face. The kid allowed himself a small smile, knowing he'd made a difference. But he didn't linger in the spotlight. Instead, he quietly gathered his notes, shook hands with the judge, and stepped outside to prepare for his next case. Because for him, this wasn't just a job. It was a calling. The kid's journey didn't stop after winning his first major case back in New Orleans. If anything, it only deepened his commitment to the fight for justice. Each courtroom victory felt like a step forward, not just for his clients, but for the entire community. People began to see him as more than just a lawyer. They saw him as a symbol of hope, someone who refused to let the system crush those without power. But with that growing reputation came new challenges, ones that tested not only his skills but also his resolve. One of the biggest hurdles he faced was dealing with the lingering prejudice within the legal system. Even though he had earned respect from many judges and colleagues, there were still moments when he walked into a courtroom and felt the weight of skepticism in the air. Some prosecutors underestimated him, assuming he couldn't match their experience or strategy. Others dismissed him outright, treating him as if his success was a fluke rather than the result of years of hard work. These attitudes frustrated him, but instead of letting them discourage him, he used them as fuel. Every doubt cast his way became another reason to prove himself. One particular case stood out as a turning point in his career. It involved a young woman accused of participating in a robbery at a convenience store. The evidence against her seemed strong. Security footage showed her near the scene, and an eyewitness claimed to have seen her holding a bag of stolen goods. On paper, it looked like an open and shut case, but the kid knew better. He understood that appearances could be deceiving, and that justice required digging deeper. When he met the young woman for the first time, she was sitting in a detention center, her head bowed low. She barely looked up when he introduced himself. "I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But no one believes me." Her words hit him hard. He'd been in her shoes once, desperate, scared, and convinced the world had already written him off. That memory pushed him to approach the case with even more determination. He started by reviewing every piece of evidence meticulously. He watched the security footage frame by frame, noticing small details others had overlooked. The angle of the camera distorted certain movements, making it unclear whether the person in the video was actually carrying anything. He then turned his attention to the eyewitness. After interviewing the man multiple times, he discovered inconsistencies in his story. The witness admitted under questioning that he hadn't actually seen the young woman take anything. He had simply assumed based on her proximity to the crime. Armed with this information, the kid prepared his defense strategy. He knew the prosecution would rely heavily on the video and the eyewitness testimony, so he focused on dismantling both. During the trial, he presented expert analysis, showing how the camera angle created misleading images. He cross-examined the witness gently but firmly, exposing the gaps in his account. By the end of the trial, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that the case against the young woman was built on shaky ground. In his closing argument, the kid spoke directly to the jury, appealing to their sense of fairness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this isn't just about deciding guilt or innocence. It's about ensuring we don't convict someone based on assumptions. My client deserves the same presumption of innocence we'd expect for ourselves or our loved ones. Let's make sure we get this right, not just for her, but for all of us." When the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty, the young woman broke down in tears, hugging the kid tightly. "Thank you," she sobbed. "You saved my life." For him, those words carried more weight than any award or recognition ever could. They reminded him why he chose this path, to give people a second chance, to remind them they mattered, and to show them the law could work for them, not just against them. As his reputation grew, so did the demands on his time. Lawyers, activists, and community leaders reached out to collaborate with him on various projects. He worked tirelessly, juggling court cases, advocacy efforts, and speaking engagements. Despite the long hours, he never lost sight of his mission. He believed deeply that true change required action both inside and outside the courtroom. So while he fought individual battles for his clients, he also pushed for systemic reforms that addressed the root causes of injustice. One of his proudest achievements during this time was helping establish a free legal clinic in his old neighborhood. The clinic provided resources and guidance to people navigating the justice system, offering everything from advice on bail hearings to assistance with expunging criminal records. He staffed the clinic with volunteers, including law students, eager to learn from him. Watching these young people grow and develop their own passion for justice filled him with pride. He often told them, "This isn't just about careers, it's about making a difference. Don't forget where you come from and always use your skills to lift others up." Despite his successes, the kid wasn't immune to setbacks. There were days when the weight of the work felt unbearable, when the injustices he witnessed left him feeling powerless. One particularly tough case involved a teenager sentenced to years in juvenile detention for a minor offense. No matter how hard the kid fought, the judge upheld the sentence, citing mandatory minimum laws. Walking away from that courtroom, he felt defeated, wondering if he'd ever truly make a dent in such a broken system. But then he remembered something his mother used to say, "Even the smallest light can shine in the darkest room." Those words stayed with him, reminding him that progress wasn't always immediate or dramatic. Sometimes it came in tiny victories, a reduced sentence here, a dismissed charge there. Other times it came in the form of planting seeds of awareness and inspiring others to join the fight. He realized that while he couldn't fix everything overnight, he could keep chipping away at the walls of injustice, brick by brick. Over time, the kid's efforts began to gain national attention. He was invited to speak at conferences, write op-eds for major newspapers, and appear on television shows discussing criminal justice reform. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to step into the spotlight. But he soon realized that using his platform could amplify the voices of those who weren't being heard. So he embraced the role, speaking passionately about the need for change and urging others to get involved. His speeches resonated because they came from a place of authenticity. He didn't sugarcoat the realities of the system or pretend he had all the answers. Instead, he shared his own struggles, the nights spent studying by candlelight, the fear of walking home late and being mistaken for someone else, the sting of being judged before given a chance. And he always ended with a call to action. "If I can rise above these challenges, so can you. Together we can build a future where justice is blind to color, wealth, or background." By the time he reached his mid-30s, the kid had become a household name, not just in New Orleans but across the country. His story inspired countless young people to pursue careers in law and activism. Schools named scholarships after him, and murals of his face appeared on city walls alongside quotes about perseverance and justice. Yet despite the fame, he remained humble. He still lived in the same neighborhood where he grew up, driving an old car and wearing suits that had seen better days. To him, material success meant nothing compared to the impact he could have on others' lives. Looking back on his journey, the kid often thought about the judge who had laughed at him during his first court appearance. That moment had stung, yes, but it had also lit a fire in him, a fire that refused to burn out. In a strange way, he owed part of his success to that judge. Without that initial dismissal, he might not have found the courage to stand up and prove himself. And now, as he stood in courtrooms advocating for others, he hoped he was setting an example for judges, lawyers, and anyone else who doubted the potential of marginalized voices. Because in the end, his story wasn't just about one person overcoming adversity. It was about the power of belief in oneself, in others, and in the possibility of a fairer world. And as long as there were people willing to fight for that vision, the kid knew the battle for justice would continue. Years passed, and the kid who once stood in a courtroom wearing an oversized suit became one of the most respected figures in the fight for justice. His journey wasn't just about personal success. It was about leaving a legacy that would outlast him. He knew he couldn't change the world alone, but he believed deeply in the ripple effect of his actions. Every person he helped, every speech he gave, and every reform he pushed for planted seeds of hope that could grow into something bigger. One day, while preparing for a high-profile case, the kid received an unexpected letter. It was from the judge who had laughed at him all those years ago during his first court appearance, the same judge whose decision to dismiss the charges had changed everything. The letter was short but heartfelt. In it, the retired jurist admitted that meeting the kid had been a turning point in his own life. "I didn't realize it at the time," the judge wrote, "but you taught me something important. True justice isn't blind. It sees clearly, even when we don't want to look." The kid read the letter several times, each word sinking deeper into his heart. For so long, he'd carried resentment toward that judge, viewing him as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. But now, reading those words, he felt a strange sense of closure. The judge hadn't been perfect, but neither was anyone else, including the kid himself. What mattered was growth, learning, and the willingness to admit mistakes. That letter reminded him how powerful forgiveness and understanding could be, not just personally, but also within the broader fight for reform. Inspired by this unexpected connection, the kid decided to reach out to others who had shaped his journey. Teachers, mentors, friends, and even critics. He wanted to thank them for their roles, whether intentional or not, in helping him become who he was today. One by one, he called or visited these people, sharing stories and reflecting on the past. Some were surprised to hear from him after so many years, while others welcomed him warmly, eager to catch up. These conversations reinforced a lesson he'd learned early on. No one succeeds entirely on their own. Behind every victory are countless hands lifting you up, sometimes without even realizing it. As his career progressed, the kid began shifting his focus from individual cases to larger systemic changes. While defending clients remained close to his heart, he realized that fixing the cracks in the foundation required more than courtroom victories. So he started working closely with lawmakers, community leaders, and grassroots organizations to push for policy reforms. From ending cash bail systems that disproportionately affected low-income communities to advocating for better training for law enforcement officers, he tackled issues that had plagued the justice system for generations. One of his proudest accomplishments came when a new law was passed in Louisiana aimed at reducing racial disparities in sentencing. The legislation didn't solve every problem. It never could, but it marked a significant step forward. Standing alongside activists and politicians at the signing ceremony, the kid couldn't help but smile. He thought about all the nights he'd spent studying, all the battles he'd fought, and all the people who had doubted him along the way. None of it had been easy, but every challenge had brought him closer to moments like this. Of course, not everyone agreed with his methods or supported his efforts. Critics accused him of being too idealistic, arguing that some problems were simply too big to fix. Others dismissed his work as performative, claiming he cared more about headlines than real change. At times, these accusations stung, especially because they often came from people who didn't understand the daily struggles faced by marginalized communities. But instead of lashing out, the kid chose to respond with patience and facts. He invited skeptics to join him in the trenches, showing them firsthand the realities he worked to address. Slowly, but surely, some of them began to see things differently. Despite the criticism, the kid found strength in the relationships he built along the way. Many of the young people he mentored went on to pursue careers in law, education, and activism, carrying forward the torch he had lit. One former mentee, a teenager who had attended his legal workshops years earlier, became a public defender, and credited the kid for inspiring her career choice. Another founded a nonprofit organization focused on youth empowerment, using the lessons she'd learned from him to guide her work. Watching these individuals thrive filled him with pride, knowing his impact extended far beyond what he could achieve alone. In his later years, the kid slowed down slightly, allowing himself moments of reflection. He spent weekends gardening in his backyard, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing life. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to chat, asking for advice or sharing updates about their lives. On holidays, his house buzzed with laughter and music as family and friends gathered around the table, swapping stories and reminiscing about old times. Through it all, he remained grounded, cherishing the connections that made life meaningful. But retirement wasn't part of his plan. Not fully, anyway. Even as he stepped back from active practice, he continued writing, speaking, and mentoring. His memoir, titled From the Streets to the Stand, A Life Fought for Justice, became a bestseller, resonating with readers across generations. In its pages, he shared not only his triumphs, but also his failures, fears, and doubts. He wanted people to know that heroes weren't born. They were made through grit, resilience, and a refusal to give up. Toward the end of his life, the kid looked back on his journey with gratitude rather than regret. He had faced unimaginable challenges, but he had also experienced profound joy and fulfillment. More importantly, he had played a role in shaping a better future for those who came after him. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he thought about the young boy he used to be, the one who dreamed of fairness in a world that often seemed unfair. That boy had grown into a man who refused to let the odds define him, proving that even the smallest light could shine brightly in the darkest places. And though his story eventually came to an end, his legacy lived on. Schools named auditoriums after him, scholarships funded dreams in his honor, and murals painted on city walls reminded passers-by of his courage and determination. People continued telling his story, not as a tale of one extraordinary individual, but as a testament to the power of belief, perseverance, and collective action. Because in the end, the kid's greatest achievement wasn't winning cases or changing laws. It was inspiring others to believe in themselves and in the possibility of a fairer, kinder world. And that, he knew, was a victory worth celebrating.